This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Empire of the Sun. Empire of the Sun was originally released in 2005 by GMT Games and designed by Mark Herman. This game supports 2 players and takes 6 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Empire of the Sun. In this episode, we're going to begin working our way through the game's sequence of play, starting with the reinforcement phase. The reinforcement phase is broken down into a number of segments, the first being the reinforcement segment. So let's get started. Reinforcements arrive according to the reinforcement schedule, or due to an event card. There is a reinforcement schedule for each player, one for the Allied player and one for the Japanese player. Each reinforcement schedule will show the at-start units that are placed on the game board for the campaign, the counters to place for reinforcements each turn, and the counters that are placed by way of event cards. The Allied player places all their reinforcements first, and then the Japanese player does so. Also remember that a reinforcement counter will show its game turn arrival on the upper left-hand side. Counters that arrive by event card will have a star on their upper left-hand side. Reinforcement placement on the game board has specific hex requirements. First, the hex must be friendly, which means in control of the side conducting the placement. The hex must be within activation range of that side's HQ and also in supply. The placed unit must also adhere to the hex stacking limits. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the hex must be free of enemy aircraft and carrier zones of influence. Reinforcements must never be placed in an active enemy zone of influence. However, placed units may generate new zones of influence to restrict enemy unit placement. This can be an important strategy for the Allies who place their reinforcements first. The hex must also have appropriate facilities to receive them. Ground units will need a port, naval units will need a port, air units will need an airfield, and HQ units will need a port. Keep in mind, HQs arriving as reinforcements on the current turn fulfill activation and supply requirements for reinforcement only in the hex they occupy. Next, let's talk about delayed reinforcements. There is a delayed reinforcement space in the lower right-hand corner of the game board. Reinforcements can be delayed for a number of reasons, such as event card plays. However, the primary reason for Allied reinforcement delays is due to the war in Europe. The status of the conflict in the European theater is abstracted into levels and shown on the War in Europe track. Level 1 or greater means Allied reinforcements will be delayed until the next game turn. And the more severe the level, the greater the chance that certain US units will be sent to Europe and take longer to return to the Pacific theater. Let's walk through how this process works. At the beginning of game turn 2, the Allies receive a number of reinforcements during the reinforcement phase. Since the War in Europe marker is in the 0 box of the War in Europe track, the level is 1, which means that Allied reinforcements are delayed. Therefore, the Allied player places all Allied game turn 2 reinforcements in the delay box, except for the SEAC HQ. All Allied HQs and B-29 units cannot be delayed. Per the setup rules, the SEAC HQ is placed in Calcutta, India. Therefore, besides this one HQ unit, due to the War in Europe level being 1 or greater, these reinforcement units will be delayed until the beginning of turn 3. However, there is a chance that certain US units will be sent to Europe for a longer period of time. Units eligible to be sent to Europe include U.S. Army ground and air units, but not Marines, plus U.S. CVE naval units. But this does not include CV or CVL naval units, which are not eligible. And all other units are exempt from being sent to Europe. To determine whether these units are sent requires a Sent to Europe die roll. A die roll is made individually for each eligible unit when it is placed in the delayed reinforcement box, even if this occurred due to an event. If the Sent to Europe die roll for a unit falls in the indicated range, determined by the current War in Europe level, the reinforcement is placed on the game turn track 3 turns later to re-enter play as a reinforcement. And when a Sent to Europe unit re-enters play as a reinforcement, it is as if it were attempting to enter play for the first time. Therefore, a unit can be sent to Europe multiple times per game. Also be aware that the die roll is modified by -1 for inter-service rivalry. Once all the Sent to Europe die rolls are resolved, the remaining reinforcements wait in the delayed box until the beginning of the next turn. Then they are released to be placed on the game board, and if the War in Europe levels are still above 1, the next turn's reinforcements are placed in the delayed box, and so on. If the War in Europe is below the level rating, then the Allied player receives all reinforcements from the delayed reinforcements box and the reinforcements for that turn. There is an exception to all this, though. If the delay is only because of inter-service rivalry, only U.S. Army are placed in the delayed reinforcement box, and other reinforcements are received normally. Finally, players may also place reinforcements in the delayed box if for any reason a reinforcement unit does not have a usable point of entry. Then the owning player may voluntarily delay the entry of that reinforcement. The unit remains in the delayed reinforcement box until it can correctly enter play during a subsequent reinforcement phase. Keep in mind, though, an Allied delayed reinforcement is eligible each turn it remains in the delay box to be sent to Europe, and must make the appropriate die roll to determine this. Generally, all Japanese, US, and most Commonwealth ground units are amphibious assault capable. Dutch, Indian, and Chinese units are not. Amphibious assault allows a ground unit to move from any coastal hex with or without a port to any other coastal hex with or without a port, at a distance equal to a naval unit in the current offensive. We'll talk more about amphibious assaults in a later episode, but this is the segment where the points needed to conduct them are tracked. Conducting an amphibious assault costs amphibious shipping points, or ASPs. When a ground unit uses amphibious assault, the cost in ASPs is based on its size. A unit's size is based on the number of X's at the top of the counter. Smaller sized ground units, such as a brigade or a division, cost 1 ASP. Larger ground units, such as a corps or an army, cost 1 ASP per step. So a full strength unit would cost 2 ASP, and a reduced strength unit would cost 1 ASP. At the start of each scenario, both sides begin with a number of amphibious shipping points. This total is tracked with the ASP marker, the one with the little boat on it. The Allied ASP marker starts at 0 and increases by 1 each turn, unless the War in Europe level is a 3 or a 4. In that case, the Allied player does not get an additional permanent ASP added to their total for that turn. The Japanese ASP marker starts at 7. This is the total ASP points that the Japanese receive for the entire campaign. Keep in mind, these are the total number of points a player can use each turn. These ASP totals can be changed. The Allied player can reduce the Japanese player's total ASP with submarine warfare attacks. However, hand's total ASP can never go below 1, so they will always have at least one amphibious shipping point per turn. The allied player can never lose any ASP. However, the allied player does have a strategy card in their deck that adds one permanent ASP to their total. Now that we've covered the totals tracked with the ASP marker, let's talk about using points. For every ASP point that is spent, the player uses the Amphib Shipping Used marker to keep track of the number of ASP points remaining for that turn. At the start of a new turn, players will reset their Amphib Shipping Used markers to indicate they have the full amount of points available. Finally, let's discuss Japanese barges and Allied PT boats. Japanese strategy card number 73 has the barge event bonus. If played during the game, this gives the Japanese a limited ability to allow ground units to cross one sea hex side into an adjacent island on a 3 operation card play. The allied play of the PT boat card cancels the Japanese barge capability, or if played before the Japanese play the barge card, supersedes the ability for the Japanese to play this event later in the game. Once the ASP markers are updated on the strategic record track, players move on to the next segment. Each side receives replacements in several ways to bring reduced strength units to full strength and to bring eliminated units back into play. One replacement point can bring one eligible reduced unit to full strength or one eligible eliminated unit back into play at reduced strength. An eliminated unit can also be brought back into play at full strength for 2 replacement points. The allied player places all replacements first, and then the Japanese player does so. Unless specifically indicated otherwise, all allied replacements that are not used in the turn of their arrival are lost, whereas Japanese air and naval replacements can be saved for future use. To receive replacements, reduced units already on the map must be supplied and not in an unneutralized enemy zone of influence. Eliminated units returning to the map are placed identically like reinforcements. Thus, HQs that arrived as reinforcement during the reinforcement segment can now be used to place units only in their hex. Air and carrier units arriving during the replacement segment cannot neutralize enemy zones of influence to allow other placements during the same segment. However, air and carrier units that arrive during the reinforcement segment do neutralize enemy zones of influence during the replacement segment, possibly allowing placement in additional hexes. Pre-war units from the Allied and Japanese sides cannot accept replacements, except through an event that explicitly allows it, and consequently, when eliminated, are permanently removed from play. These units are marked with a single dot on the front and back of their unit counters. If pre-war units, including HQs, leave the map for any reason, they are considered eliminated and cannot return to play. Next, we're going to take a look at Allied and Japanese specific replacement rules. Next, let's discuss rules specific to Japanese replacements. The Japanese player receives a limited number of naval replacements during the course of the game, as indicated on the replacements chart. These may be used to either bring reduced naval units to full strength or bring eligible naval units from the eliminated unit pile back into play. Japanese naval unit replacement steps are not lost if not used, and may be carried over from game turn to game turn. Keep track of them with a naval replacement marker on the strategic track. As for Japanese air unit replacements, there are no scheduled replacements for Japanese air units. The Japanese player may receive a small number of air replacements through the play of certain events. As for Japanese ground unit replacements, there are no scheduled replacements. During the replacement segment, the Japanese player may bring up to 2 replacement steps from China. This is done by reducing the available number of Japanese divisions in China by 1 or 2, which gives 1 or 2 ground replacement steps accordingly. Additionally, the play of some event cards may yield Japanese ground replacements, which the Japanese player must use as required by the card text. Now let's discuss allied replacements, beginning with ground replacements. The allied player receives 2 ground replacements per game turn, starting with game turn 2. All replacements that cannot be used are lost. Allied ground replacements may be used for reduced or eliminated US and Commonwealth ground units. As for air replacements, the allied player receives 5 per game turn. These can be used for any reduced or eliminated allied air units that can take replacements. If these replacements are not used during the turn, they are lost. For naval replacements, the allied player receives a number of specific naval replacements as per the replacement chart. If they cannot be used, they are lost. Additionally, the allied player can gain 1 US naval replacement per turn if they control Oahu, and 1 Commonwealth naval replacement on turns 6, 9, and 12 if they control one of the hexes shown. China replacements. If China has not surrendered, the allied player receives 1 Chinese replacement on every odd-numbered game turn. This Chinese replacement may be used to either bring an eliminated Chinese army back from the eliminated pile at reduced strength into Hex 2407, which is Kuming, or bring a reduced strength Chinese army back to full strength. Note that since Kuming cannot be attacked, it will always be an available location for returning Chinese army units. A Chinese replacement can be placed in Kuming only if it is available as a supply source. Chinese replacements that cannot be used in the turn they are received are lost. Other replacements may not be used for Chinese units. And finally, for the Dutch, there are no replacements for Dutch units. Once a Dutch unit is eliminated, it is permanently removed from the game. Once Japanese and Allied replacements are resolved, players move on to the next segment. The next segment in the reinforcement phase is dedicated to strategic warfare. Strategic warfare is all about determining Japanese and Allied strategy card hand size. The number of strategy cards, which represent resources in the game, drawn for each side is determined by conditions on the map and the outcome of Allied strategic warfare. Let's begin by discussing resource hexes. The Japanese player is entitled to draw 1 strategy card for each 2 resource hexes under Japanese control, rounded up. However, the draw is always at least 4 cards, regardless of the number of resource hexes. The number of cards drawn can be modified by strategic warfare. The following are the 14 resource hexes. Before the Japanese card draw is made, the Allied player conducts Submarine Warfare. The Allied player rolls the die and subtracts the game turn number from the die roll. The result is then modified by the following factors. Any Japanese escort events, each of which add 2 to the Submarine Warfare die roll, and the Allied player adds 1 to the die roll for all 1942 game turns due to defective torpedoes. If the modified die result is 0 or less, the Japanese draw is reduced by 1 card. However, the Japanese draw cannot be reduced below 4 cards. Then, the Japanese player permanently loses 1 amphibious shipping point. Please note the Japanese ASP cannot drop below 1. And finally, any escort modifier in effect is reduced by 2. For example, a +4 goes to a +2 or a +2 to 0. Next, let's cover strategic bombing. Only US B-29 long-range bombers may conduct strategic bombing. There are 2 of these units. The first arrives on turn 9 and the second on turn 10. To conduct a strategic bombing, a B-29 must be in supply and either in an airfield within its 8 hex range of Tokyo or in the Air Units in China box. B-29 reinforcements cannot be delayed, and they may conduct strategic bombing on their turn of entry if they meet all of the appropriate conditions. A B-29 returned to play through replacements may not conduct strategic bombing during the turn it was returned from elimination. Also, B-29s that conduct strategic bombing cannot participate in battles during offensives, but may activate in reaction if opposing units enter their hex. The strategic bombing procedure is very simple. The Allied player rolls a die for each B-29 unit that is participating in strategic bombing. A full-strength B-29 successfully strategically bombs Japan on a die roll of 0 through 8 and fails on a die roll of 9. A reduced-strength B-29 successfully strategically bombs Japan on a die roll of 0 through 4 and fails on a die roll of 5 through 9. Each successful strategic bombing reduces the Japanese strategy card draw for that game turn by 1, but not below 4 cards. An unsuccessful strategic bombing has no effect. However, when conducting strategic bombing, any time a full or reduced strength B-29 rolls a 9, the B-29 loses 1 step unless the Allies control an airfield that is within 5 hexes of Tokyo. This hex can be the same hex the B-29 is located in, for instance, Iwo Jima. Also note, the Japanese high-altitude interceptors event adds 1 to the strategic bombing die rolls until the Allies control a supply-eligible airbase within 5 hexes of Tokyo. Finally, there are also B-29 event cards that may also reduce the Japanese player's card draw. There are Allied event cards that reference B-29 unit locations that may reduce the Japanese hand during the offensive phase. These effects are in addition to any strategic bombing effects. Note, the Japanese can lose at most 2 cards during strategic bombing, but may lose additional cards due to B-29 events during the game turn. And once these elements of strategic warfare are conducted, it's time to move on to the next segment. The number of cards a player can draw during the deal strategy cards portion of the reinforcement phase are based on the game turn and other factors. The number of cards a player holds in their hand at the start of a turn is also important because it determines the initiative of who plays first. Turn 1 touches off the war in the Pacific with 2 specific strategy cards played for their events by the Japanese. Operation Z, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and IAI Operation No. 1, the conquest of Southeast Asia. The Allied player does not draw any strategy cards in turn 1. In subsequent turns, card opportunities for each side vary. In turn 2 through 4, the Japanese player is functioning on stockpiled reserves and receives 7 cards. The Americans receive less cards in turn 2 and 3, as their engagement in the war ramps up, but also receive options to pass, playing a card. The Japanese player also receives passes based on the number of cards that they draw. If the Japanese player receives 6 cards, not including a possible future offensive card, they receive 1 pass. If they receive 5 or less cards, once again, not including a possible future offensive card, they receive 2 passes. A pass may be used instead of the play of a card during the offensive phase. These markers can be used to record the number of passes available on the strategic record track. Keep in mind that passes are lost at the end of the offensive phase. There are other activities that affect the number of cards available to play, but these typically do not reduce a player's hand below 4. As we discussed earlier, for the Japanese, these are resource hex bonuses, submarine warfare, strategic bombing, and B-29 event cards. On the other side of the conflict, the Allied players' cards can be impacted by the surrender of allies like China, India, and Australia, or if the war in Europe reaches level 4. When this occurs, they draw 1 less card to their hand for each instance. However, they also receive a pass option for each of these as well. And now that we've completed all segments of the reinforcement phase, this is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode of this series, we will look at the offensive phase. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel and click the bell icon for notifications so you'll know when this episode becomes available. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.